yet powerful foes.
Hey there, demons, deities, and devil summoners. Welcome back to another special episode of Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei game, where instead of my usual spiel of trying to trick you into playing whatever Megaten game I recently cleared out of my backlog, I instead try and trick you into checking out some non-video game related Megaten media, and this time round, since the game just re-released, we'll be talking about the Persona 4 Arena and Ultimax mangas, and more specifically, whether or not they work as a good replacement to the Arena and Ultimax story modes. This is essentially my way of covering Persona 4 Arena Ultimax while it's relatively fresh in everyone's minds. And since I already played both games a while back, I didn't really want to play them both again just for the sake of doing a review. That, and I also really don't have enough to say about Ultimax to make up a full video that somebody else hasn't already said before. I love fighting games, but I'm not really good enough to be talking about specifics or really reviewing one in terms of its mechanics per se. And the reason why I'm covering this one in particular is more just because it's part of a JRPG that I like. So of course I'll be focusing on the story instead. For the purpose of what I want to say throughout this video though, I will give a quick rundown on Ultimax in general, as well as the new port. Persona 4 The Ultimax, the Ultra Suplex Hold, is a fighting game and the sequel/updated version of Persona 4 The Ultimate and the Mayonaka Arena, the game that ultimately got me into Persona and later SMT as a whole. A story that I've already gone in before on the first episode of Play a Real Shin Megami Tensei game. So if you're interested in that, check out my Soul Hackers review. Needless to say though, the game is one that I hold pretty near and dear to my heart. What makes Arena and Ultimax so special as games is the fact that while they are very clearly technical high-speed anime fighters, or air dashers if you will, the design philosophy in making them was to make a fighting game that appealed to the fans of the Persona series and easing them into fighting games as a genre. And this was done in a number of ways. Things like auto combos were not invented by Persona 4 Arena, but they were definitely popularized by it. And the characters and the gameplay systems were specifically designed with the original JRPG in mind. A seasoned Persona player would be able to look at various moves in the move list and work out roughly what they did just by their names alone. They'd be able to tell that Yukiko's Dia will heal her, Tsukukaja will be able to increase Yosuke's speed, and marrying Karin is useless and should never be used. All of these things make a cast of very unique playing characters with some very unorthodox stuff for a fighting game, which in turn also made it a little bit hard to balance, resulting in some very fun bullshit that the characters can do, which is why certain members of the FGC will refer to this game as Kosoge. For the uninformed, Kosoge is a term that quite literally translates from Japanese as shit game. However, it's usually used with a affectionate connotation. In the fighting game community, Kosoge is used for a lot of things, whether it be weird and bizarre indie shit. Please play Dong Dong Never Die, it's amazing. It's the only game where you can have Mario block a Chinese girl's Optimus Prime stand and then raging demon her right away afterwards. Or just used for things that are kind of unbalanced and not really that well designed for the dreaded esports, which usually means I love them. And Persona 4 Arena kind of fits into this due to that design philosophy of putting in more fun referential stuff before focusing on gameplay balance. Now, all of this is a really good example of how Arc System Works did an amazing job designing Arena and Ultimax with fighting game newbies in mind. Unfortunately, this brings us to what they did a bad job designing for those fans, which is the game's story mode. That is not to say that the story itself is bad, quite the opposite actually. While it definitely feels like a short epilogue arc, with it technically being the third one for the investigation team, I still think the story itself is pretty charming, and Labras is honestly one of my favourite Persona characters of all time. The show's alright too, I guess. The problem instead lies with how it presents the story to the player. Before Arc System Works were just putting 4-hour-long films in their titles, their game stories typically followed the usual fighting game method of having a arcade mode that just had a few lines of dialogue before certain fights. And the likes of P4A and BlazBlue kinda acted as this evolutionary point where these arcade modes were becoming more and more involved with their stories and essentially just becoming visual novels. They were, however, still tied to the arcade mode-like structure, and this caused a lot of bloat to happen in the game's story. Persona 4 Arena's story mode takes place 2 months after the end of Persona 4, and Yu has returned to Inaba for Golden Week after going back home to his parents. On literally his first night back, he checks the Midnight Channel just for old time's sake, and even though he knows it shouldn't come on, to his surprise it actually does. And what it shows is basically an ad for a pay-per-view style wrestling tournament. The next day, the original 4 Persona users of the investigation team all meet up and hop into the TV world to investigate. While all of this is happening, to tie the Persona 3 cast to the story as well, we see the Shadow Operatives trying to track down some stolen cargo from the Korijo group. Mitsuru and Aigis both follow the trail left by the thief back to Inaba, where they meet up with Akihiko, and since they're privy to the police reports of the events of Persona 4 Golden, they realise that the thief is most likely escaped into the TV world, so they also give pursuit. Now, I don't plan on boring you with the specifics of the general problems with Persona 4 Arena's story. If you're watching my channel, chances are you already know why, but if you don't, just watch any other review and they'll tell you. The basic gist of it is that the arcade structured story mode means that nearly every single character has what is essentially the same 1 to 2 hour story, except the details such as who fights the big bad at the end is changed, with most of the other differences between each character really just boiling down to some fun fan service for each one of them. And this is where I thought the manga adaptation could come and save the day. After all, Persona 1's manga helped bypass a lot of its major problems, such as having a very limited cast per playthrough and fleshing out those characters a bit more, as well as just not having any old-ass dungeon crawling. It definitely still had its own problems and doesn't actually adapt the gameplay portion of the game, but I still think it stands on its own very well and acts as a more accessible and in some ways better way to enjoy the game's story. So I thought to myself, with Persona 4 Arena's problems being all related to the media that it's in, maybe its manga can do the same. And it most certainly can. Sort of. The manga tries to do its best at what I was hoping it would do and tell a chronological story whilst also homogenizing as many story routes as it can into one, which is unfortunately only 2 with a few tiny bits from the others sprinkled in here and there, but it's pretty decent for what they could get away with. The problem is many of these story routes can't coexist with each other simply for the fact that the entire story revolves around a knockout style tournament, with the loser of each round being trapped where they fought by invisible walls. And with a cast of 13 characters and technically only 10 of which being entries in the Grand Prix, it leaves only 8 or 9 potential fights before whoever wins has to confront the mastermind behind it all. And what we end up getting is a manga that poses Aigis and Yosuke as the 2 focal characters for their respective games joining together. For Aigis, this makes a lot of sense since the stolen cargo was in fact Labras, and minor spoiler alert, she is an earlier generation shadow weapon, one that was shut down and put away years ago. Which obviously makes Aigis the perfect pick for this, since she probably has the highest stakes of any other character in this story, since she is essentially saving her sister. But it also means that Aigis can be shown off as a person and show how much growth has occurred since the ending of Persona 3. And while all of the P3 cast have grown since then, Aigis, with how she left off, finally accepting herself as a person over a machine, means that she definitely had the most potential for growth. And on top of all of that, Aigis in Arena's manga is honestly just so endearing, even without all of the funny speech bubble edits of her flowing around online. Yosuke being the second pick, and arguably the one who got more of his story actually adapted, is honestly quite interesting. By itself, it's pretty cool just seeing Yosuke take a leader position, but it's also funny how between the Persona 4 manga adaptation, the Persona 4 one-shot prequel manga, and this manga, Yosuke has kind of become the main character to 3 different mangas. I guess the authors just love that Junes brand aftershave. But putting all of that aside, he's honestly the right choice for the P4 rep to take the spotlight, for a number of reasons. For starters, in the Grand Prix, everybody is shown illusions of their opponent acting strangely to get the 2 of them to fight. This is usually them preying on the other person's insecurities and digging up old wounds from the past, but in Yosuke's case, each illusion is based off of the stupid wrestling tagline that describes them in that ad that was shown on the Midnight Channel. Stuff like Chie, the carnivore whose discarded womanhood seemingly wanting to eat Yosuke when they fight, and my personal favourite, Yu Narukami acting no different to his canonical self, screaming Nanako's name 24/7. And this isn't even me joking, this is something the manga absolutely agrees with me on. Speaking of Mr. Narukami actually, that brings me to my second reason why I think Yosuke is actually a really good pick for the P4 rep of this story. Yu being a blank slate character in the original Persona 4 means that giving him a voice is a bit tricky. While the Persona 4 anime kind of turns him into a huge freak, Arena kind of plays it safe, and while it does give him a voice and a personality, he is still very much designed to be that blank slate character. This isn't a huge deal, but it does kind of make his story feel a little bit devoid of personality. It also unfortunately makes the game's already overabundant amount of internal dialogue that it has even worse, since Yu doesn't really have anything to add to scenarios, he simply just describes what's happening in front of him, which you could have already inferred from the text. The only real appeal of his route is that throughout it he'll take several little naps where he hops off to the Velvet Room and gets little info dumps that are really not needed. Outside of that, he kind of just goes on about how cool friendship is and how he solves his problems with it. Yosuke's route, on the other hand, does have a bit more going for it, with Yosuke no longer avoiding that leadership role that he was always very adverse to before. At the same time, however, it doesn't really veer off into its own thing and stop following the general main plot points as much as some of the others do, which makes it really good for having a story route that still has a bit more character and soul to it compared to Yu's, but still works as a canonical general route. I also believe that out of the entire cast, Yosuke has the most genuine response to Labrys's reveal of being a robot, but is also the most accepting to this change. And while every character has a bit of a speech trying to help Labrys calm down and tame her shadow, I think for the most part, most of them wouldn't actually help Labrys calm down. For example, Yu goes on about how cool friends are, but Labrys has never experienced that, so it's not something she can actually relate to. Yosuke, on the other hand, while taken aback by Labrys being a robot, instantly curses himself as he realizes that at the end of the day it's not that important whether she's a robot or not, she's still a person, and him backing off is clearly hurting her, and he doesn't want to do that. I think it's one of the few times in Persona 4 Arena that the internal dialogue is actually beneficial to the storytelling, and I also really like how it shows how Yosuke's matured as a person, since he certainly didn't have the best reactions to the idea of people being different in Persona 4 Golden. And it is one of the few things that I think that the manga kind of misses out on, but it's ultimately not really worth the mountains of pointless text that you have to read otherwise. Regardless, I think that with both Yosuke and bits of Aigis' routes combined, what we get as an end result makes a pretty decent canon route for the story's events. Unfortunately though, I said earlier that most of the characters follow the same 1 to 2 hour story, but that is barring both Labrys and Elizabeth's story. The former probably being the most important story mode in the game, and the latter being a continuation of plot points from Persona 3, ones that certainly won't blue ball any fans over the coming years. Elizabeth doesn't even show up in the manga, and Labrys' story is kind of reduced to a few flashback panels while Shadow Labrys is monologuing, and the absence of both of them is incredibly unfortunate, as it means that even with the manga, you still need to dip into specific aspects of the game to properly prepare yourself for Ultimax's story mode. Because of this, I either recommend beelining it through Arena's story, or just watching one Persona 4 character, one Persona 3 character, Labrys and Elizabeth's stories online, and then moving on to Ultimax. If you're really enjoying it, then by all means go ahead and do the others, just don't burn yourself out before Ultimax, because then you're only getting part 1 of the story. Either way, it means the manga can kind of work as an adaptation, and maybe if you want to go back and re-experience the story in a slightly different way, then it's a very good way to do so, but it really isn't very good for replacing the whole game like I'd hoped. Moving on to Ultimax, the manga adaptation was done by a completely different mangaka to the original vanilla one, and it is not a follow-up to that manga specifically. In fact, the Ultimax manga is pretty much a one-to-one recreation of the game, or at least half of it. See, Ultimax does have split-up story routes, just like the original Arena. However, instead of multiple ones for each character, there is just two, ignoring DLC. And those being the episode P4 and episode P3 routes, with the two of them essentially dictating which team gets to play a bigger role in the story and also who gets to be the main character, with you obviously taking the role on the P4 route and Labrys taking the role on the P3 route. And then there's the episode Culprit, which follows the P4 story but from the viewpoint of the villain of Persona 4. The manga adapts the Persona 4 route pretty much word for word, at least up until some of the later chapters, and it even implements some of the unique scenes from episode Culprit as well. And to top it all off, it also includes the game's true ending, which is actually a bit of a pain to unlock in-game, as it requires beating the final boss 4 times and picking one different dialogue choice for each character in the cutscene afterwards. The art is also incredibly gorgeous, being done by the same mangaka as the Persona 5 Memento Mission series, and it's super clear that they're a huge fan of Persona with the amount of love and extra illustrations that they put out for these things. My main takeaway is if you're interested in Ultimax's story but you really don't want to play through a visual novel, then the manga is basically a perfect adaptation of the P4 route. And since only episode P4 gets the true ending unlocked at the end of it, you can definitely say this is a perfect adaptation of the canon events of the story. Which is a bit of a shame, since I think episode P4 kinda sucks. Or at least it's not as good as episode P3. I very briefly mentioned earlier that Yu's route in P4A kinda consists of "Ha ha ha, I'm a villain. Don't be a villain, have friends instead. Friends are bad. Actually no, friends are good. Okay, maybe I will try friends." And Ultimax story, at least when you're playing through the P4 route, is basically "Ha ha ha, I'm a villain. Don't be a villain, have friends instead. Friends are bad. Actually no, friends are good. Okay, maybe I will try friends." It's literally just the same thing again. There are some cool and funny moments in there, but the actual narrative of episode P4 is just kinda weak. But more importantly, it barely includes Labrys, which just seems super weird, since Vanilla Arena ends as if it's setting up Labrys as a character who's finally gonna have her own journey. Not only has she finally gotten a chance to live a real life for once, but she also has pretty deep ties to the villain of Ultimax. And on the P4 route, she shows up very briefly and doesn't really do much. In fact, all of the new characters added in Ultimax, barring Rise, really don't do an awful lot on the P4 route either, which means that they have next to nothing to do in the manga. It feels really weird having all of these newcomers in the game, and in the manga having a bunch of characters show up in the final act to go, "Yeah, we'll do something," and then they're never shown again. It's honestly shocking how much of an improvement episode P3 is over P4, especially when you have to beat the P4 route to unlock the P3 one in the first place. I'd even wager that there is probably a significant amount of people who skipped the P3 route because they assumed it would just be the same but with the P3 characters. And it's actually something I really don't want to talk all that much about, because I think Labrys' story is genuinely something pretty special. And while Sho isn't quite as strong as a character in my opinion, I think the dynamic between the two works incredibly well, so I do implore you to please give Ultimax and its P3 episode a chance. I genuinely believe as long as you cut out a lot of the fat from Arena and Ultimax, what you get is a genuinely compelling story. It's just that all of the extra stuff that most people instinctively go through as well really isn't worth it. Just like Vanilla Arena, I'm gonna recommend a really weird way of playing through Ultimax, and that is to play the P4 route up until you meet Culprit in the school, and then skip every single cutscene until you get to the end, beat the boss, unlock P3 route, and then play through that normally. And then if you really want to give P4 a chance, then read the manga. It'll be a fresh way to experience the first half of that story, and you get some bonus stuff in the second half, which is pretty fun. It is really unfortunate, and it kind of makes me sad. I said before in my video on the Yosuke prequel manga that I'm really not fond of adaptations unless they're actually bringing something new to the table, or they're improving upon what's already there. So when I decided to read the mangas to Arena and Ultimax, I was really hoping they could fix the presentation problems of the game and act as definitive tellings of the stories, and while in a lot of ways they are, the two of them basically scrub Labras out of her own story to the point that she's basically just a plot device. So much to the fact that I really can't in good faith recommend them as alternatives like I do with the Persona 1 manga. I think it's really telling that when I was redoing the original thumbnail into something that looked much better and also captured the original feel of the manga a bit more, I had next to no actual Labras art to work with, despite her being one of the main characters of this arc. So instead, I had to kind of subtly work her into the background, just like how she kind of was with Ultimax. So yeah, in the end, Arena/Ultimax's story mode is still either a long bloated mess, or something that requires a map and a Sherpa to properly navigate through. Which is a shame, because I really think that a lot of people who aren't fighting game fans could find stuff to enjoy in this story. It's just the presentation and the way it's told is just really bad. I really don't want to end this video on a negative note though, so I do want to mention that a lot of the original stuff added in the mangas are really good. Ultimax has a bunch of little changes and adjustments that help scenes flow a little bit more naturally, and has additions like Shadowyu wearing the belt from the box art and almost wanting to become Yosuke's partner before Chie kills him. And the addition of episode Culprit into the main P4 story, as well as a few scenes to give a bit more context to show's background, really make the P4 story a little bit more fun and interesting, and actually give the entire thing a bit more substance to it. The vanilla Arena manga, on the other hand, gives us Master Troll Igus, even if it wasn't directly, and honestly, that's as good as a gift as anybody could ask for. Anyway, that's all the time I've got. I have to torment people online as Mint Choc Chip Chie Satonaka, so enjoy your day everyone. I'll see you all next time with some more Falcom and more miscellaneous RPG stuff coming in the future. But if you are just here for the SMT content, then do expect a video for my panel at PersonaCon 2022, and a Raido 2 review before I cover Soul Hackers 2. Hopefully now I'm actually big enough to get a code for this one, because I don't want to be super late like I was for SMT5.